We have in this session now two people who are going to speak on their presenting findings from impact evaluations, not just one impact evaluation, but a range of studies. We have Justin Sandefur from here in Centre for Global Development, who has worked across a range of countries, mostly in Africa, who's going to be talking today about education. And John Hoddinott, who has been at IFPRI for many decades. I was surprised to hear he'd actually worked somewhere else before that. But he's going to be talking about conditional cash transfers and nutrition. So we're starting with Justin. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so the title of my talk today is What Are We Learning About Learning from Experiments? This is going to tap into a literature that Scott referred to in the first session, which is going to be evaluations of interventions intended to improve student learning, mostly in primary schools, a little bit in secondary schools. So, and if I was writing my title again, I would probably say, what are we learning from rigorous evaluation? I'm going to talk kind of beyond just experimental evaluation. This presentation draws on a couple of different papers, but a big part of it is built around a paper, kind of a literature, maybe I can call it a polemical literature review that I just finished with my co-author Lant Pritchett, also here for now, the Center for Global Development. So all of the polemical pieces I will blame on Lant. But our argument in response to this question as our title, what are we learning about learning from experiments and from impact evaluations, we want to put forward that the answer is that it depends, that what we're learning, one of the things we're learning, not the only thing we're learning by any means, but that the answer is kind of radical heterogeneity. Impacts are very different in different contexts, and it really depends on the context, both institutional, geographic, and so on, in which we do the evaluation. And then we want to reflect a little bit, kind of ad hoc at the end, if the answer depends so much on these complex arrays of context, what does that mean for what we should be doing in terms of impact evaluation? Okay, so a long outline, but I've basically got one slide on most of these things. Cataloging what works. I don't know what to call this. Maybe a paradigm of impact evaluation, a way we can think about what we're doing in terms of impact evaluation, cataloging what works. I don't want to claim that it's a paradigm that we all inhabit. I think this paradigm actually doesn't describe very well the stuff that Suzanne described the IADB doing this morning, and so we can come back to that tension at the end. And maybe this is, we're going to kind of take issue with this paradigm of doing impact evaluation. So maybe in that case it's a straw man. I hope it's a straw man. And what I really want to do here is talk about we're turning away maybe from one model and towards a new model of thinking about what we're doing in impact evaluation. Then I want to confront some of the evidence in just a few kind of literatures. One on contract teachers, some of my own work in Kenya with co-authors, but also kind of some meat and potato literatures in the economics of education, class size effects on learning, and the returns to private versus public schooling in developing countries. And finally, I'll, as I said, wrap up with some meta thoughts about what this all means for the impact evaluation agenda. Okay, so very briefly, this kind of paradigm of impact evaluation as cataloging what works, I want to point out kind of what I see as four components of this. One is sort of a lexicographic evidence ranking, where we prioritize first and foremost internal validity of our studies over concerns about external validity. You can read, like in the British Medical Journal, and you'll see a strict hierarchy of evidence from systematic and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials to individual randomized controlled trials with a definitive result, working their way down to case control studies and cohort methods and so on. And this comes from, some of you are familiar with, in the US Department of Education, hosts something called the What Works Clearinghouse, kind of a catalog of interventions that have been shown to work. And they have a very systematic way of classifying whether their evidence in a given study meets their evidence standards. The first kind of hurdle you need to clear is it randomized? If it's not randomized, it can never meet the evidence standards. You're done. You can then, if you can show baseline balance and do kind of a diff approach, you can meet the evidence standards with reservations and so on. That's what I mean when I say a lexicographic preference for internal over external validity in how we rank evidence. All right. Another issue is the highly clustered approach we typically take to evaluations. By this, I don't mean that we're doing a clustered randomized trial and we're randomizing at the school level and not the pupil level. By this, I mean we're kind of putting all of our eggs in a relatively small number of baskets. So just to pick on one individual who I who I like and know, Caroline Fine had a recent article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review saying that most charities shouldn't evaluate their work. And I think the same argument could be applied to most development programs. Because impact of a charitable effort comes from the combination of idea and implementation. And the argument here is the ideas used by charities don't need to be evaluated again. They've been shown to work well. All the charity needs to do is run the programs well again. We've shown this idea works. Let's just do it again. And that fits in, since Barbara's very smart and very knowledgeable about these things, Barbara referred to the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund of the bank. The idea of a Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund implies that there are areas that we need to produce global knowledge, so we should strategically devote our resources to those small number of projects or countries or issues, as opposed to evaluating everything we do. Finally, meta-analysis. I think this is still relatively rare, but this is a nonsensical example pulled from a study of computer science pedagogies in Australian universities. I think a better example would have been the forest plots that Scott put up from Patrick McEwen's review of actual studies, impact evaluations in developing countries. But the idea of a formal meta-analysis is that we take all the results of these studies, we pool them together, and the statistics permitting, we aim for the bottom, which is across all these studies, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or different studies, we come up with an average effect, and we have an answer. And it's the quest in many formal meta-analyses for an answer. What is the effect of this intervention? We think we've defined coherently an intervention to be class size or to be textbooks or what have you. And the last, kind of maybe most controversial piece of this kind of paradigm would be moving from impact evaluation to global policy recommendations. So this is a very fuzzy snapshot that you can't see, a paper by Abhijit Banerjee and Rumin Hay in 2008 in a volume that Bill Easterly put together. This essay, kind of famous, Making Aid Work, I think it was called, in which they go through and say, look, the World Bank in particular, Inter-American Development Bank, aren't evaluating enough of the projects they do, but look, there are rigorously evaluated projects out there that have been shown to work, proven interventions, and we could scale these things up globally. The cost of these programs is such as that we could scale these things up globally, and that's what these multilateral donors should be doing. And you see different examples there. Remedial education, the Balsaki program from India, Pratham has been shown to work. So for $644 million, we could do this on a much larger scale. Universal education at a 40-to-1 pupil-teacher ratio from Angrist and Levy's 1999 study in Israeli primary schools has been shown to raise pupil performance. Thus, we could scale this up worldwide on the basis of the Israeli evidence. Now, this is probably one of the most ambitious attempts to make global policy recommendations from fairly localized evidence. Okay, so this is a paradigm. I want to confront this paradigm with what we're actually finding from impact evaluations in education. And 3 examples here. First, as I referred to, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my own work with Mwangi Kimenyi next door here at the Brookings Institution, Tessa Bold, who's in Frankfurt, and Germano Mwabu and Alice Nganga, who are both at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. So the intervention we're concerned with is contract teachers. There's already, when we began this project, an experimental literature on contract teachers in developing countries. Karthik Muralidharan and Sundararaman, 2008, in Andhra Pradesh, find contract teachers increasing test scores by about 0.15 standard deviations. And then closer to home, where we're going to focus on in Kenya, Duflo, Dupa, and Kramer in Western Kenya find that contract teachers increase scores by 0.21 standard deviations. The experiment allows them to separate out the class size effect from contract teachers per se, and it's really the contract teachers that are doing the work, that are raising the scores. So working with the Ministry of Education, we wanted to do 2 things to kind of think about the next steps from quote-unquote proven interventions to scaling up to policy. Baby steps towards scaling up to policy, and we wanted to move along 2 dimensions. One was geographic. The ministry was very concerned that we try this in all kind of provinces of Kenya. The Kenyan map has changed since then due to the constitutional reform, but at the time, 8 provinces, and so we spread out across the 8 provinces to look at geographic heterogeneity. But kind of more to the point here, we also looked at different institutional kind of implementation partners. The red dots are where our contract teacher program was implemented by the Ministry of Education, and the orange dots are where the contract teacher program is implemented by an NGO, in this case World Vision Kenya. And so schools were randomly assigned to be either control schools, working with the MOE, or working with this NGO. To make a long and messy story clean and short, what do we find at the end of the day? Overall, the contract teacher program has depends, I can make it modestly significant, but for the most part insignificant, kind of 0.08 standard deviation effect. If we split this up between the NGO implementation arm and the ministry implementation arm, we see big significant effects in the NGO program. And the same intervention, this is a contract teacher intervention, has no effect when we move over to the government implementation. So given that the Ministry of Education's budget is on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on primary education, and World Vision Kenya's budget on education is mostly what we put into it for this project. Thinking about scaling up means working with these government systems, and that's a little bit depressing for this intervention. Okay, maybe that's just contract teachers, and maybe that's just our experiment. Let's look at more kind of thoroughly, almost researched ad nauseum topic, class size effects on pupil learning. So here's a chart. We've got even a fuller list of things. This is not meant to be comprehensive by any means. There's a slightly longer list in the paper. But just kind of pulling things together by similar kind of identification strategies. So we have different studies here in each row. And the first panel is regression discontinuity designs, all kind of inspired by this Angrist and Levy study in Israel. And the bottom half, we have actual randomized trials of class size on student learning. 3 of those in different contexts. And then moving across the columns, we start with, for the studies that report it, let's just compare pupil performance in small class sizes and big class sizes, observational variation with no controls. And all of these point estimates refer to a change of 10 pupils. What would happen if you increased class size by 10 pupils? We can do the same thing controlling for observable characteristics. The observable characteristics are going to vary a bit by study, but let's control for socioeconomic status as best we can and so on. And then finally, either the RDD design or the RCT, trying to overcome selection on unobservable characteristics. Now, a couple of things stand out for me. One, we've got this Angrist and Levy study from Israel that says, look, small classes on the whole perform much worse. Big classes perform better with no controls. They can show that's mostly due to the assignment of kind of children with special needs to smaller classes. So you need to control for that and overcome that. When they do all the controls, they get this, strong 0.26, standard deviations effect, statistically significant. You can move to Bolivia. Miguel Urquiola replicates this in Bolivia with a similar, amazingly, this is built on a discontinuity rule at which at 40 pupils, the class has to be split into more than one class. You've got an administrative rule that forces you to split up your classes. There's a similar rule, who knew, but in Bolivia, which allows Miguel to do this similar thing and get pretty strikingly similar results, I think, in terms of the final point estimate. Turn to Bangladesh. Asadullah 2005 published paper tries this in Bangladesh, which, has a similar rule. And the first stage works. It explains class size. Gets perverse and huge results. Wrong sign completely. So really huge variation there in the results. If we turn to the kind of the randomized control studies, people who follow education have probably heard, the Kruger, the STAR experiments, which came even before Kruger in Tennessee, finding significant positive or significant good effects on scores. Both Banerjee et al. In India and Duflo et al. In Kenya can also estimate the effective class size through a randomized trial and get either much smaller or no effect. So I'll skip over. You can do kind of the same thing with the TIMSS data using an IV method. You get a range of OLS estimates and a range of IV estimates that move towards more significant results, but that still have a lot of heterogeneity. What do I take away from this literature on class size effects? Well, a few things. One, the most striking feature for me is not where the mean is, but is that the variance is really, really high across studies and across countries. 2, this heterogeneity is real. It's statistically significant. These results are statistically significantly different from each other, and it affects both the treatment effect and the selection process of who gets into small classes. There just seems to be a different model at work over how class sizes are formed and what they do to pupil learning in different places. And 3, we have no clear encompassing theory to explain these widely variant both OLS and quasi-experimental results, which we would need before making any kind of bold external validity claims. I'm not saying an encompassing theory is impossible to think about, and maybe we need to be working towards that, but I don't think we have it at present. Okay, similar point in brief about private schools. A similar table, begin with kind of some of the earliest studies in developing countries by Cox and Jimenez for Colombia and Tanzania. No probably identification strategy, as we would say in modern microeconometrics, but kind of selection correction models, controlling for observables. Even the way it's calculated, it's hard to get with, unless I went back and did the delta method, I can't get a standard error on the treatment effect. But big effect sizes, 0.55, 0.97 in Tanzania. Turning to more recent literature, kind of a very famous paper, Sie and Urquiola evaluate kind of the introduction of nationwide voucher programs for private schools in Chile, and find, controlling for unobservables through kind of a clever method of aggregating the data, they find basically nothing. They don't think that vouchers for private schools did anything for student performance on average. Okay? If we turn, though, to people who've tried to apply the similar method, Tabarrok for India apply a very similar identification strategy to India and the introduction of private schools, not through vouchers, but the kind of spontaneous spread of private schools. Fairly sizable, statistically significant results. So this is Tessa Bold, Mangi Kimeni, myself, and others trying to do something similar for Kenya, just using administrative data, looking at the role of private schools in Kenya, and, huge effects. This is not an RCT. There are complaints you can make about identification, but using a similar identification strategy, really big effects. So again, what we see is, we can compare how much OLS would have misled you, but we can also compare how much taking things from the wrong context might have misled you. And there seems to be a huge amount of the heterogeneity in the findings here is across contexts, not evaluation methods. All right, so where are we going with this? A very kind of perhaps overly formal way of summarizing what I just said would be to say, let's pretend that I'm a policymaker in a new country, country J. And I'm interested in investing in more teachers to reduce class sizes in my country. I have no experimental studies or really cleanly identified good impact evaluations for my country over whether reducing class size is going to improve scores. I'm faced with two kinds of evidence. One, I've got administrative data. I can run simple regressions using my own Ministry of Education's administrative data, OLS regressions, or I can look at the best published, randomized impact evaluations from other countries and see what I learn from that. Which of these is going to be most misleading to me? Given the current state of the literature, I don't want to claim this is a universal finding, given the current state of the literature on this particular question, let's compare the mean squared error of the non-experimental estimate, which includes both sampling noise and potential omitted variable bias. There's bias in those OLS estimates. Versus the experimental estimates from a different context, which also have some sampling error, but are potentially biased by the variance in the true effect across contexts. Empirically, which of these sources of bias is more important? Well, we tried this for several different literatures. I would have to be looking at my key for which of these is which got cut off. But basically what we did, on the x-axis there, you've got the mean squared error of the kind of experimental or quasi-experimental estimates across context. And on the y-axis, the mean squared error of the OLS estimates in my own context. And if we graph the literature and it comes up above the 45-degree line, I should go with the experimental estimate from a different context. And if I graph the point and it comes up below the 45-degree line, I should stick with my own evidence at home. So we try this for RCTs of class size, for RDDs of class size, for aggregated district-level data analysis of private schools, and so on, for 5 different literatures that we just reviewed. And in every case, what we find is that the mean squared error of relying on evidence from a different context is going to be much more misleading than taking the best available ordinary least squares regression using your local data. All right. So what does this all mean? If we take this all seriously, what does it mean for what we should be doing in terms of evaluation? I don't have much more in terms of data to show you, just a few parting thoughts. I've defined what I'm calling a straw man model, maybe. Define an intervention at the school level. This is a contract teacher. That's all it is. Evaluate it in a controlled context and then extrapolate. Alternative models, which we can think of, would be to evaluate the scale up within large programs, within government systems. And Annie Duflo and Jessica Kiesel at IPA are doing basically exactly that with the Ghana Ministry of Education, evaluating something inspired by the Walsaki work in India and the work in Kenya. They're trying it with the Ministry of Education at scale to see if they can make it work. And I think that's really kind of an avenue going forward. Other alternatives, mechanism experiments, kind of Ludwig Kling and Mullainathan style. Can we break up this problem, break up our log frame into incremental steps and experiment not with the reduced form of the program to the final outcome, but experiment in the production process within the ministry along the way? Chop up the problem into pieces along the log frame, or move up the bureaucratic supply chain. What I think we found in Kenya was the problem was not so much with the contract teachers in the school, but the district education officers at a somewhat higher bureaucratic level who didn't do anything and didn't care. Can we talk about maybe education interventions should look more like political economy interventions higher up in the bureaucracy? Some interesting recent work, not experimental, by Imran Rasul and Roger with the Nigerian civil service on this front. I was going to part with some nice words for development innovation ventures at USAID, but since Howard's telling me I'm running out of time, let me just stop there with one slide of conclusions. What do we conclude? Messages for evaluators. Specify the context. Your intervention may be both bigger, i.e. it's not just a contract teacher, it's a contract teacher within an institution with monitoring systems and dysfunctional payroll systems. And so your intervention may be both bigger and thus kind of have more narrow relevance than you assume. And attempt to encompass rather than to trump previous evidence. We need to get out of the mindset of we've got an RCT that now trumps the existing evidence. OLS estimates are facts about the world, and we need to be able to explain how they came about rather than kind of brush them aside. More importantly, I think our messages are really for evaluation users. First, quite simply, to avoid this lexicographic preference for internal over external validity. Our chart showed that if anything, if we want to have lexicographic preferences, let's prioritize always looking at evidence within the institution and the country that we're worried about and not taking from elsewhere. But we don't have to be binary about it. We don't have to have lexicographic preferences in either order. And finally, this is the one where I think a lot more thinking is needed. And I don't have much to say other than to say we should think about it, but is to commission more, faster, cheaper RCTs with fewer grand ambitions. If we take all this seriously, that when I learn about what I learned from an impact evaluation is how this project works, well, then what does that mean for the kinds of impact evaluations I should be funding, how much it's worth spending on a single impact evaluation of a single program? If I believe less in the generalizability of those results, it should probably change the kinds of evaluations we fund. All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Justin. So I'd like to invite now John to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Howard. One of the themes which is emerging through the presentations this morning is that when one does impact evaluations, things don't always turn out the way you expect. That's actually also true of my presentation this morning. And I'll give several examples of that as I go through. I'm actually going to start not by actually having an introduction in the usual sense you have in these workshops, but instead a prologue, which is the email thread that led to this presentation. And it begins with this. Dear John, we're putting together an event, joint CGD and 3IE, to look at how the impact evaluation field has evolved and what's needed to improve it heading forward. We'd like to invite you to make a presentation on your views regarding what we've learned from evaluations in agricultural policy, how you see the recent crop of studies. Nice pun, Bill. I picked it up the first time. How they make a difference, and what do you think the sector needs in terms of future learning? So I thought about this for a few days. I thought, it sounds like a really good event. Sounds like a lot of fun to be part of. But there was a small problem. Bill, thanks for this message. I'd be pleased to participate. But I know nothing about impact evaluations in agricultural policy. But I know some things about other fields. I could say something about nutrition or CCTs and nutrition. Would that help?
Then the pun doesn't work.
Yeah. We could work on some puns, but this is probably not the time or place. So, and then the final. Yes, of course. That's Bill being generous, as he often is. It also could be a program organizer who wants to make sure he gets enough speakers for the event. So sure, whatever you want is good with me. nutrition would be the right topic, and if you want to work to link on CCTs, that's great. But also he says, since this is part of a broader discussion, it would be great if you could describe what we've learned, but also what you think is useful for future knowledge as we move forward. And that's really how my presentation, in a sense, ends up being structured, at least in the first version. So I start off by thinking about what do we know about literature on nutrition and either cash transfers or unconditional cash transfers. As many of you will know, there have been a number of studies on this topic, most but not always using a randomized design. Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Peru are the ones people most often reference. Sometimes you also see references to non-experimental work from Bangladesh, South Africa. I probably missed one or two other countries. One of the things you also notice if you begin to delve into this literature is that not only do these studies exist, but there are a lot of literature reviews and summary studies. This is a partial list, and again, I'm sure I've missed some. But if you look quickly down this list, you think, hey, you know, there are 7 summary studies of this topic, but there are only 9 countries and 9 programs actually on the first list. And you might say, well, you've maybe missed a few countries. I know I've also missed a few literature reviews, and it seems that there are as many literature reviews as there are individual studies. And this is actually something I want to come back to at a later point in the discussion. Well, what do we know about these studies? Well, perhaps the studies which, in fact, have produced arguably the most evidence, or strongest evidence, is one which dates back to the work done on the Progresa Oportunidades conditional cash transfer program in Mexico. Most of those studies using that data show strong positive impacts on one measure of nutritional status, height. But not all of the studies do this. Some of the positive results are not replicable. And it's not clear from follow-up studies that the impacts that some studies claim to observe actually persist over time. Other studies show small or no effects either in height, and these have been done in other countries listed on the previous page, or in dimensions of micronutrient status. The one which people focus on most often is that of anemia. When we look across these studies, what we notice is, again, using Justin Lance's notion of heterogeneity running rampant. Actually, I kind of like the idea of it running wild, but I think rampant probably sounds a little more sophisticated. But when we look across these studies, the programs differ hugely, okay? And there's huge amounts of variation in implementation. For example, in terms of the size of the transfer, the duration, the frequency of the transfers, the strength of the conditionalities, which may or may not exist, the pre-existing levels of undernutrition. Okay? If you look, for example, at recent evidence of the impact of Bolsa Familia on undernutrition in kids, it's very difficult to pick up any sort of meaningful impact. But levels of undernutrition in much of Brazil, which is covered by the program, are now so incredibly low, which is a good thing, that in fact you wouldn't actually expect to actually see impacts to begin with. And of course, there are variations in the quality and availability of health services, and that also surely will have some effect. So if we look at this literature, it's really actually very difficult to support a strong view of the impact of cash transfers or conditional cash transfer programs on nutrition. And so as a result, when you then go back to all these literature reviews and summaries, it gives the authors, considerable scope to interpret basically the same set of evidence. Okay? Some people are cautiously optimistic. Other people, for example, the cautiously optimistic people include, for example, Ruel and Alderman in a recent paper in The Lancet, to the pessimistic work done by Manley and others, which is based on a meta-analysis. Now, you'll notice that I was supposed to talk about the literature on cash transfers and nutrition, and it's kind of over. So this is where I began to think again about, going back to this theme that things don't always work out the way you like, I began to think about, well, what is it that in fact we can actually learn from this literature itself, not only in and of itself, but sort of more generally in terms of the themes of the workshop, in terms of learning more and learning better. So to move forward on that, I thought I'd do, I won't call it an experiment, we'll call it kind of a fun exercise. And this is a tale of 2 experiments. Okay? I want you to tell, this is all true, this story. Experiment number 1 actually was just an experiment. It's not actually an impact evaluation. There was a little bit of pre-testing done before this went to the field. It had 240 subjects in 6 non-randomly selected localities, and it's a cross-sectional study. Experiment number 2 actually was an impact evaluation. It was preceded by at least about 5 years or so of preparatory fieldwork and smaller studies, When it actually went to the impact evaluation phase, they had 26,000 subjects, which were randomly assigned to either to treatment or control status across 450 localities. There was both a pre-intervention and post-intervention survey. There was minimal attrition, very careful attention paid to implementation. So my question for you is, if this is all you knew about these two studies, how many of you would be convinced by experiment 1, and how many of you would be convinced by experiment 2? Okay, let's hear it for experiment 1. Come on, let's see some hands. Oh, no. Experiment number 2? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. So it looks like now there's an additional piece of information you might like to know. Yeah? The first experiment was wildly influential in its field. It has, and this is an underestimate, at least 3,000 citations. This is it. Okay? The second study clearly had influence, but not nearly at the same level. If we take a very simple metric, citation analysis, it is a fifth of the citations. Okay, so what's going on? What gives here? Well, as I said, these are both two published experiments in highly regarded journals. The first one is the experiments that Hans Binswanger did in the late 1970s and 1980s to elicit measures of risk aversion in 6 semi-arid Indian villages. And this is all economists who work on development needed to know about risk aversion. Okay? Easily for the next 20 years, if you ever asked about risk aversion among smallholder farmers anywhere in the world, what would economists say? Well, we know they're somewhat risk averse. We're absolutely sure of this because once some guy went out and interviewed 240 farmers and played some experimental games with them. That's all we needed to know. The second study is the work done by a Johns Hopkins scientist named Alfred Sommer. He's actually an optometrist by training in Indonesia. It was done in the mid-1980s on the impact of vitamin A deficiency on infant and child mortality. And it showed that, in fact, that providing vitamin A supplementation in the first 2 years of life had dramatic effects on reducing infant mortality. Now, you would have thought, certainly by the standards of the economists who just love Binswanger's study, that that would be, wow, we should scale up right away. But in fact, over the last 20 years, since his work, there have been at least 40 more RCTs trying to verify this result in different settings, different localities, all on the subject on vitamin A deficiency and infant-child mortality, and in some sense, over and over again, trying to demonstrate whether or not, in fact, this is actually real. Certainly, all the evidence overwhelmingly is that, in fact, this is actually real effects, and there's now widespread vitamin A supplementation for children in early life. So this is kind of interesting. It's kind of a fun sort of thought experiment to work through. But what does it tell us about the way in which we, particularly economists and perhaps policymakers who work with economists, actually use and interpret data, and also impact evaluations? And what we might learn from actually the way in which this is actually moves forward in other fields. And so this is the third part of my presentation. Well, from part one, in my very brief review of CCTs and nutrition, we know that economists are starting to use much more robust evaluation techniques when they look at these nutrition outcomes, and that's absolutely a strength. One of the things that Bill mentioned in his presentation this morning is it's important to actually pull back and actually reflect on literatures, to do summary work, meta-analysis, and so on and so forth. And that's something we see in this area as well. But arguably, it's both a strength and a weakness. It's a strength because for precisely the reasons you're describing. But there's a cautionary tale because although there are a lot of these reviews, they're all on the same set of studies. And there's this element in this literature of everyone doing reviews, and so over time, in fact, the received wisdom is based on the reviews, not so much necessarily on the underlying studies. Parenthetically, I've got another example of this type of phenomenon. A number of years ago, Chris Barrett at Cornell and myself were asked by the World Food Programme to do a literature review on the disincentive effects of food assistance. Because we interacted with people at WFP, they told us everyone knows that food assistance has disincentive effects on labor supply. And everyone was like in bold, caps, underlined. So Chris and I and a third colleague, Aaron Lentz, started to go back through this literature. And what we found is like summary studies and literature reviews that make this claim. And they would reference other papers, and we would go back to those papers. And those other papers were literature reviews. And we kept going back and back and back. And eventually we discovered 2 studies which actually made this claim empirically. one of which was methodologically was very badly flawed. But in some sense, by repeating over and over again through this process of literature review, there was in some sense this myth developed that in fact these disincentive effects existed. So literature reviews, I think as Bill is right, is clearly a very important role to play, but they shouldn't obscure us from actually knowledge about the breadth of the underlying information that we have. Arguably, part 2 tells us that economists relative to nutritionists can have lower evidence standards. We can be easily satisfied by one study. And although I'm making light of it, it was a very real feature of the work by Binswanger on risk aversion. I remember as a graduate student being told, no, there's actually no reason to try and replicate that work. We know the answer. Okay? Whereas in other fields, such as nutrition, it's not really clear that, in fact, people actually take that to heart. So what are some of the things we can learn by looking by the way in which nutritionists and others, both themselves methodologically, how they work, and also how that might play into issues around knowledge and influence, things that Nancy Birdsall was talking about this morning? Well, at IFPRI, we have a lot of nutritionists, and here are some of the things which I've picked up from some of the way in which they go about doing their work. One of which is that they put a lot of value on what they call formative research, both qualitative and quantitative, and oftentimes on small-scale pilot studies. And to a certain extent, what nutritionists call formative research is what Scott was referring to when he talked about causal chain analysis. Okay, and I think if I take Scott's examples, I can actually give a really good one and actually relate it back to Justin's study. Okay, so you get a group of economists together and you say, what is the impact of class size on learning? And you get all sorts of people who get really excited. They have all these ideas, these hypotheses, blah, 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 blah. But whether there's this fact, was the study done right, da, 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 da. In that discussion, no one ever says, well, can kids actually see the blackboard? And if you can't see the blackboard, well, it's not obvious that any size of class is actually necessarily going to have an effect or not on these learning outcomes. And so one of the reasons I really like the work you did on the eyeglass study is it starts with that very basic premise. And literally in some ways, as you described it, is you have some of your research staff and you actually sit in the classroom. And you notice, there are kids at the back who can't see what's on the blackboard. Well, that might actually have something to do with learning, and that might be more important as to whether or not there are 42 or 38 kids in that class. A second thing that nutritionists do is they pay quite a lot of attention to power calculations. And this is particularly an important issue when there are multiple impacts. And one of the things which I know is very good about and very nice about the way 3IE now works is they require people to do power calculations as part of the proposals they put forward. But there's an issue as to what about these power calculations when there are multiple impacts. A very good example of this in the context of nutrition and cash transfers is work done by my friend and former colleague John Lucho in Nicaragua. One of the things you take out from the literature when you do the summary literature is the claim that his study in Nicaragua shows that there's no impact of the Nicaraguan CCT on nutrition. If you go back and look at the point estimate actually is relatively large. It's tolerably well measured. But the study itself was actually underpowered on that outcome because the core focus of the study was actually on other outcomes, which is how they did the initial power calculation. So in fact, it's quite possible that in fact there actually genuinely was an effect, but the study was underpowered for that particular impact. Third, my nutritionist colleagues spend a lot of time both on understanding and learning about program implementation. And again, this is something that Nancy and Bill, and there's some of their remarks this morning, talked a lot about when they talked about process evaluation. It's certainly clear in our work at IFPRI when we work on, for example, cash transfer programs, that information on implementation, what worked, what didn't, why that was occurred, is enormously valuable, first of all, to the implementers themselves. It's also very valuable for policymakers who want to see to what extent, in fact, they should actually build up that program, put money into strengthening its existing implementation, and so on and so forth. It's important to note that economists ascribe no academic value to these studies whatsoever. And as economists, we like to think of people being guided by incentives. And it's clear, I would argue that there's an issue in terms of thinking about how you go forward, which is that information which is clearly of value, some sort of, in a sense, to policymakers, people who are implementers, is of no value oftentimes to the people who are actually doing the impact evaluation work. Which is slightly ironic because actually understanding how implementation, compliance, and take-up can affect results is a very important part of actually a very good impact evaluation. And again, I go back to the work done by my colleague John Lucho in Nicaragua. one of the things you find in these summary studies is that the Nicaraguan RPS, which had both a cash transfer component and an iron supplement for preschool children, had no effect on anemia. You say to yourself, well, that's kind of weird, okay? Because biologically we know when kids consume iron capsules when they're very young, that should improve their iron status. Well, John and some of my AFP colleagues were kind of bothered by this. So after the study was done, they actually went back and did a whole series of very intensive case study interviews, focus groups with mothers, interviews with health staff, and so on and so forth. And sure enough, that they found, for example, some problems with the supply chain of the iron capsules, which was a bit of an issue. But the bigger problem they discovered is that kids actually didn't like consuming the iron capsules. So in fact, the kids would spit them out or refuse to take them. When mothers got asked about this because they wanted to make sure they looked like they were complying with the program conditions, they said, oh yes, of course, little Jose is taking his iron. But in fact, he wasn't. So what you see in the summary studies is there was no impact of this conditional cash transfer program on anemia status. When the truthful result is you have control communities where kids are not getting iron supplements, and you have treatments where effectively they're not getting them either. And we shouldn't be surprised that there was no impact. Nutritionists place a lot of emphasis on distinguishing between efficacy and effectiveness, or I think what Scott referred to as upscaling trials. Does it work under ideal conditions? Does it work under ordinary conditions? And in a way, I would actually interpret some of the results that Justin was presenting just a few minutes ago in exactly this context. Okay, is that if you think back to the Kramer work on contract teachers, in essence, that was an efficacy trial, okay, when there was very tight control about how this particular intervention worked. That's absolutely informative. Is that informative? Absolutely so. Is it, in some sense, convincing enough that, in fact, we should take these things to scale everywhere in the world? And the answer, of course, is no. Is that, in fact, what we want to do is we want to then complement that by effectiveness trials, not least of which is just work done by Justin and his colleagues shows, is that all sorts of problems in implementation crop up, and those implementation problems may be sufficiently strong that they actually scupper or they limit the effects of the intervention. Oftentimes, when we look particularly at conditional cash transfer programs, but also other types of interventions, we actually have multiple treatments within the same bundle. And although that may tell us as to whether or not collectively the bundle works, it doesn't tell us which particular part might be most important. And so, in effect, evaluations with multiple treatment arms are of particular value. Okay? And this is certainly something which is needed in the area of CCTs and nutrition. Finally, a few more things. One of which is the notion of replication, replication, replication. Okay? First of all, do researchers document their work sufficiently well so that other researchers can actually replicate those results? A very nice thing that 3IE now has set up is actually a replication window where researchers actually are invited to actually, in some sense, pick a study and actually see whether or not they could actually replicate the results of the researchers. I've been on the receiving end of 2 of these. It's probably fair to say the first 5 minutes after you read the email, it induces a very strong sense of anxiety. But at least in our case at IFPRI, we make sure, in fact, people actually do track their do files. We archive the data files and so on and so forth. So the anxiety lasts all of about 5 minutes. But it seems to me, okay, all right, 10 minutes, right. But it seems to me this is something where, in fact, nutritionists put a lot of emphasis on, is the ability of other people to replicate the results. And it's something that economists or people working more generally in impact evaluation probably need to put more emphasis on. The second replication, 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 which is my idea of a bad pun, you see replication appears under 2 bullet points, is that identical interventions are evaluated in different places. Okay? And again, Justin, I think, gave some really good examples of this in the context of his work on nutrition. The fact we see something working really well in one place is probably not enough for us to say we should do it everywhere in the world. Okay? A more interesting question is to whether or not, in fact, in the context of thinking of your portfolio of impact evaluations, do you want to have, in some sense, a scattershot approach of actually, in some sense, having 10 people evaluate 10 different things in 10 different places? Or do you actually want a somewhat more concentrated approach, where you say, let's take this one particular topic, which we think is strategically really important. Let's actually think through our causal chain analysis of exactly what a good intervention should look like and why we believe ex ante it should have effects. And then let's try and do that in 3 or 4 different places. and see to what extent, in fact, we actually observe same effects in different places. Or more likely, if we observe different effects, what is it that could explain that? So to take an example of this, we just finished work with the World Food Programme, where we did a 4-country study of randomizing food and cash transfers to recipients, where, as much as possible, we tried to keep all dimensions of the interventions the same within countries. So within a country, the value of the food and cash food basket was the same as the cash. The frequency of transfers was the same as much as possible. The timing was the same, and so on and so forth. And what we found in 3 of those 4 countries is if you wanted to improve various measures of food security, cash outperformed food. But interestingly, there was a 4th where, in fact, the food basket was much more effective than the cash basket. And we put these studies in a line. What we found is where the food outperformed the cash was the country which was the country and the locality which was far poorer than the other 3. What we found with some of the other work we did is in that very poor country, which is in Niger, that in that locality, people got cash who were clearly very hungry and very food insecure. They did what any rational person would do, is they went out and bought as many cheap calories as they could. Whereas the food basket, which had grains for sure for calories, but it also had pulses for protein and oils for essential fatty acids. So in fact, in terms of improving food security, in terms of both quantity and quality of diet, in that particular case, in fact, the food basket was actually the better thing to provide than the cash transfer. And that's one example of this idea, in some sense, of the benefits of actually taking the same idea or same design and doing it in different types of places. Now, some of these discussions, both this morning, both in our presentations and also in the earlier presentations, had this interesting mix. There was kind of, I wouldn't say self-congratulation, but there was kind of joy about how far we've come along, like Bill's graph, going up this way. But there was also kind of some anxiety about, maybe things aren't going nearly as well as we would really like. So I thought I'd end with maybe one final example from the nutrition field, which maybe is a little more positive. And that is work, it's called the INCAP longitudinal study. It's a study of a randomized nutrition intervention that took place in the 1960s and 1970s in rural Guatemala. A feature of the existing design, it was relatively small scale in terms of numbers of villages, but could only be described in terms of anally retentive in terms of implementation. So it was basically contrasting, feeding, making available to kids a really nutritious supplement, and basically giving, in some villages and in other villages, allowing them to have, in effect, the equivalent of Kool-Aid. Okay? All villages got like the same basic health care. The feeding centers were exactly the same, like down to what the color was on the walls. They were worried that basically the staff involved, might affect the way in which people would behave. So staff were rotated randomly from village to village over time, so you didn't have those effects. They kept track of how much each kid consumed of the supplement, and it ran for about 6 years. Towards the end of the 6 years, NIH, which U.S. National Institutes of Health, which funded the study, looked at the evidence, looked at the results, and said, you know what? Fundamentally, this intervention is having no impact. So with relatively short notice, the whole thing got cut off and closed. About 8 or 10 years later, one of the principal investigators in this work, Rinaldo Martorell, tried to do a follow-up. Follow-up was underpowered, didn't actually go back and try and trace all the individuals. And there was kind of some suggestion that maybe there had been positive effects. But with some of the data analysis, it was clear that the investigators are really kind of having to pull and pry to try and kind of tease out some sort of positive effect. Well, in the early 2000s, Martorell and a group of researchers, including myself, went back and tried to find these people one more time. And it turned out that the initial intervention actually had huge long-term effects. Being exposed to this nutrition supplement between 0 and 36 months improved your scores of tests of cognitive ability as an adult on the order of a quarter of a standard deviation, which if you think back, for example, to some of the presentations that Justin and others made this morning, is actually a huge effect. We know for men, it increased their wages on the order of 40%. Okay? Not for women, but women generally find it difficult to work in wage work in this part of Guatemala. And we have evidence to suggest there are also interesting pathways, okay, that the supplementation trial improved nutritional status in early life. Early life nutritional status is at least correlated and arguably causally related to a whole series of life outcomes. Your earnings. It turns out it affects who you marry. That being better nourished, in part through this intervention, means you get a better mate in the marriage market. Better mates, combined with better earnings, means you are less likely to be poor and have higher levels of per capita incomes as adults. So this all reinforces, I think, one of the themes that a number of people who have suggested, which is as we think about these interventions, these impact evaluations, is to think about not only what they show in the short term, but actually trying to design and document them. So in fact, it enables long-term effects to be teased out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I will abuse my position as chair to make a couple of comments first myself. Justin, can we have your presentation back up, and can you pull up the forest plot?
Which is, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
you've got in there your arbitrary forest plot. Okay, thanks. So two comments. One about, and I think Bill did mention this, about what's changed in the last 5 years. If we'd had this meeting 5 years ago, no one would have mentioned systematic reviews because no one would have known what they were. Yes. Even when we started 3IE, we were talking about we were going to produce what we called at that time synthetic reviews. And then we ran into this whole systematic review community that would refuse to allow us to change the terminology that they had established over a few decades. So I'm very glad to see, because when we were presenting the programme, I kept saying to Bill, we should have some systematic reviews presented. And he was like, yeah, well, we'll have some people talk about primary studies. And they're all coming with forest plots. But I don't think we've got so far that everyone actually knows what a forest plot is. So, Justin, could you just explain the plot?
Barely, but all right. So each row here is intended to be a separate study, which they've just numbered for anonymity. And as I said, this is a nonsense example unless you care about consumer computer science pedagogy in Australia. But we've got two different methods across different studies. Each square is a point estimate. So the first study finds a positive effect of about half a standard deviation, and then these lines crossing through them give us a 95% confidence interval. And then the goal, or one potential goal, you don't have to go this route, but one potential goal of a meta-analysis using a forest plot would be to aggregate the data, either you're using some sort of random effects or fixed effects model, right? Aggregate the data across these studies to come up with an overall average effect, and that's the diamond there at the bottom.
That's right. And so in this particular case, you've got significance test against null hypothesis of 0. So where the confidence interval crosses the line, a vertical line at 0, then that study finds no significant impact. And if it stays clear of that, then the study finds a significant impact. So forest plots are actually very powerful tools for visually summarizing a range of studies. And we always push our authors to do forest plots. Whether or not you then combine those into a single average treatment effect across all studies does depend on the heterogeneity you see in those studies, and there are formal tests of heterogeneity you can do to see whether meta-analysis is sensible or not. And I mean, you can always see from this one almost straight away it's not, because you're all over the place. But it does depend on what you want to do, what evaluation question you're answering. So we also have. Scott mentioned the education review that's just been done, which drew a lot on education review we supported, published by the Campbell Collaboration, which reviewed also 70-odd studies of the impact of education interventions on enrolments and attendance and various intermediate outcomes like dropouts, and then also and repetition, but also on learning outcomes. And when you aggregate across 70-odd studies, you're aggregating across a whole range of different education interventions, conditional cash transfers, teacher training programs, computer programs, enormous heterogeneity in the interventions themselves, done across all low and middle income countries from Argentina to Andhra Pradesh, and so it's a great heterogeneity in the context. So does it make any sense to actually combine all of those different studies in a single meta-analysis estimate? And we had a huge debate about this in our own office in 3IE. And my view was, yes, it does. Because what you see when you do that is, basically, you can say everything works. Now, it's not true everything works, but on balance, things we do to get kids into school work. On balance, things we do to keep them in school work, and surprisingly enough, the things we do to improve learning outcomes also work. So the pessimists that we don't know how to do anything are proven wrong by that analysis, but actually, bulk of what we're doing is proving to be effective. Now, of course, there's heterogeneity in those studies, and the conclusion that on balance everything works doesn't mean just go out and do anything, because everything works, because that's not true. So you have to break it down and say, well, which bits do work and which bits don't, and under what circumstances. And we live with heterogeneity all the time, and we learn from heterogeneity. There's a very nice systematic review, I think, just being published that we supported, done by Burke Osler at the World Bank and Sarah Baird, also here in Washington, which is looking at conditional cash transfers. And they broke down conditional cash transfers into 6 categories, depending on how stringently the conditions were applied. And they showed the more stringently you apply the conditions, then the bigger the impact on child enrolment or attendance, which is all like, well, a duh moment, or duh, but actually to have a really clear empirical statement of that across the 6 categories, the impact is larger, the average treatment effect is larger as the stringency of conditionality goes up, is very reassuring and answers the question, do conditions matter, I think quite convincingly. And so we can learn from looking in the data, mining the data in a good way, to unpack what's in there and learn from heterogeneity. We deal with heterogeneity all the time. We couldn't just say, oh, it's heterogeneous, we can't do anything. John just gave an example. There was a long-run impact for men, not women, because for women don't have good wage market opportunities. We didn't think, oh my God, heterogeneous impact. We said, well, here's the reason. And so we learned something from that. So you learn from heterogeneity. The second point I wanted to make, and it came up in the morning presentations as well, are these problems of incentives in producing impact evaluations. And those incentive problems of getting academic researchers to engage in impact evaluations are going to grow as it becomes harder to publish an impact evaluation. About 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you could publish a randomized control trial in QJE because it was a randomized control trial. It doesn't matter what you're evaluating. As long as it's a randomized control trial, you can publish it. But that's less and less the case. So you have to think of something more and more bizarre to evaluate to make it worth getting published in a top journal. But the problem is we don't actually want to know about really bizarre things. We want to know about, do development programs work? And there is this trade-off between evaluating, I think 3i was set up to evaluate mainstream development programs carried out by large-scale development agencies. And that's not, by and large, what a lot of our studies finance. In the bank, I think you see a comparison between CF and DIME in the same way, that a lot of our proposals, and particularly in the early days, were coming from researchers who had bright ideas of ways you could tinker with things to make things work better. And this whole approach is motivated by the nudge philosophy, that indeed you can make these small changes in the margin and you can change behaviour, and people therefore adhere to adopt good things they should be doing and change their behaviour in good ways. But the problem is, I mean, I say 2 problems with this, it's not always true. So the things that researchers think are good ideas don't always prove to be good ideas. And we've run into, so I think actually it was, Susanna was talking about this, we've run into lots of problems where we commission huge impact evaluations of interventions that just don't take off. So to give a couple of examples, medical male circumcision, that in areas where 78% of men say, yes, I'd like to be circumcised, I know it's a good thing to be circumcised, reduces the risk of contracting HIV, and the researchers hypothesised, well, the problem is cost. So they did subsidised cost of male circumcision, so you basically have to pay. 78% of men said, oh, I want to be circumcised. When the guys turn up on the doorstep with the scissors, they change their mind. Yeah? So it actually goes down. Even if you give it away for free, it's like 20% of guys actually say, OK, go ahead. So there's something else going on there, but our study suddenly became enormously underpowered. We had another study which actually we managed to capture in the early days and pull the plug on, which was going to be in an African country sending out thousands of SMSs to parliamentarians to make them aware of what was going on and things they should be in and vote for and so on. And we found out in the early days there was some hitch in the system, so only a couple of thousand SMSs had gone out, but actually only 100 of them have been read, and that was all by one person. So we didn't think it was worth spending $500,000 to evaluate that because, you find out the thing's not going to work. So the importance of doing formative research, of just seeing, can this thing actually be implemented? And if it can, is anyone actually interested in doing it, taking up the intervention, is hugely important. So what we've moved to at 3IE, and first of all in some work we're doing on self-testing and male circumcision, is we first want to collect formative evidence. Unless you can show us it's there, you know there'll be take-up and this program will work at scale, we won't fund a fully fledged impact evaluation. We'll do the formative research first, and then we'll do the funding for full-scale impact evaluation if there's formative research in place. Once you've moved that, this is one to have a different understanding to John on this, then once you've got the larger study, which hopefully will be an effectiveness study, not an efficacy study, you still need to build in these process evaluation elements to do is unpacking the causal chain to understand, once you go to scale, things do work differently. It's what Justin's work is showing. Things do work differently at scale to when you do a small-scale efficacy trial, and we need to understand what are the problems and mishaps in implementation that cause that. Okay, so I wasn't on the programme, so I'll stop talking and throw open to the floor. Thank you. So Marie, please do introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Marie Gardner from the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank, and formerly 3IE. I had a question for Justin. First of all, very fascinating presentation, particularly the plot where you compared the average RCT effects and the predictability using that versus local non-experimental type of measurements. And one issue there, though, as far as I understood it, you were then assuming that the local RCT was correct. So you were measuring against that. And there is some recent research looking at, and it was mentioned as well, the replication work that 3IE is financing. And I think there have been some mixed findings on the quality of RCTs that has been looked at. So first of all that, and then the other issue on this was that you took the average effect sort of uncritically across a lot of very different contexts, and you could, it seems to me, you could break it down and look at more similar type of countries and contexts, and how would that affect your findings? And to John, a reflection on the plethora of CCT systematic reviews. An interesting case is, of course, that you missed one, and that was actually I think the first one, which was done. Amanda Glassman and Amanda at the CGD in 2006. So interesting that didn't come up in your presentation. But the other part of that is that we sort of decided to expand it and do an updated search in 2010. And we did find so many more studies, so I think it was quite worth it to do it again. And following a little bit your argument, you would have said that we could have settled with our first one. Thank you.
I was just reflecting a little bit. I think it was Scott who earlier talked about the Journal for Non-Response, and John's point about learning from nutritionists and the kind of information that is maybe required or more traditionally provided, and then Justin's point about randomization often being the first hurdle to being considered as evidence. And it's just, especially, I'm speaking mostly from the health field, public health field, where I find that when you want to discuss in a manuscript context, heterogeneity, policy implications, methods, the process of doing the evaluation, or the theory of change, you simply haven't got the room, and it doesn't fit the journal requirements or structures. And you're then missing an important dissemination channel for most of your health colleagues. And I don't know if that's similar for education or other. It's a little bit easier in some of the other disciplines and the important journals. The word lengths are longer, but I find that this is this is a huge problem also when you're not using a traditional method or an RCT type of method, when you need to really describe all the things that you did in order for your results to be understood and interpreted properly. And there's simply not space for that often, or there's no interest in it.
Thank you. Sorry, let's go here first.
CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Just a quick follow-up note on that last point regarding the unpublished data, inaccessible, the results of negative trials. In the medical field itself, there has been a strong move to create these require registries for clinical trials, and you basically can't publish data unless you have registered in those clinical trials. And I'm just curious, I don't know if that has taken place in other fields, but it seems like that is at least it doesn't necessarily help with publication, but at least it gives a systematic listing of all the trials that were actually put forward, with the hopes of publication.
Yeah, I'm Cheryl Gray from Head of Evaluation Independent Evaluation at the IDB, and I wanted to ask Howard, I guess, but anybody, about how much you find you're able to draw from other disciplines. I have this sense that 10 years or so ago, the economist profession kind of swooped in on evaluation, even with, frankly, a little bit arrogant, when will we ever learn, when there's a lot of work being done in other disciplines that I don't think economists pay much attention to. Actually, one little interesting piece, this year the American Evaluation Association is having its annual meeting here in Washington. And it's, 3,000 or 4,000 evaluators that come from all disciplines and share all kinds of experience. Of course, I also come from the economics profession, so I'm guilty as well. But I mention it because I think, we're learning, as I think people would have told us 5 years ago, some from the other professions, you can't just take the beginning and the end and without looking at the black box. And a lot of the other professions, it seems to me, have been looking in much more detail at the black box and really trying to understand the process. Maybe they haven't done quite as well on the attribution. I don't know. But I guess my question is, after this discussion today, and particularly with 3IE, are you able to really fund work from a lot of different disciplines? Is my hypothesis at all true, or is there not that much out there? And I just appreciate your perspective a little bit on this issue of disciplinary sharing of information and approaches.
Okay, thanks. So perhaps I'll respond as that question was to me. On the previous two speakers, so 3IE is founding a registry for impacts in development development interventions. It will be so it should be launched by September. So that will be out there, and we are working towards what the requirements will be for registration there. And Annette will talk a bit about it this afternoon. For those who have problems publishing in other journals, publish in the 3IE Journal of Development Effectiveness, which takes anything. I mean, subject to peer review, but we don't have very site-page constraints, methodological considerations. We want to hear about methodologies, so do think about it. Cheryl, and I come from an interdisciplinary background originally, and very keen on people drawing from other disciplines, and economics has a tendency to try to take things over and make them their own. Like, behavioural economics comes out of cognitive psychology, and you wouldn't know that, really. Talk to most economists, or many economists wouldn't even know that, it seems. You had the whole paradigm wars in the evaluation community here in the 1970s when RCTs were being done on social programmes, and that involved a lot of people who were not economists. So there's a lot to learn from that. But to answer your question, which I think underlay what you said, was, do we fund... most studies we found investigating those teams are economists, with some exceptions being political scientists. And one thing we want to try and do is to involve sector specialists more closely in our studies. So we'd rather than having impact evaluations being a particular field that a group of economists and some political scientists do, we'd rather have impact evaluation being one of the research tools that researchers use across all disciplines, and they use that method when it's appropriate. Because we don't believe, as Bill was saying the first thing, we don't think impact evaluation answers all questions in the world. We think it answers particular sets of questions. and it's what researchers use when they want to answer those particular questions. So we had a panel last year now at the GGN conference on urban development. We had a series of studies in that sector, and they came and presented, and I got a discussant who was an urban studies specialist from LSE to come and discuss on the panel. And his main comment was like, you guys are living in the past. All the indicators you're looking at we just don't think they're relevant anymore. We assess urban development projects against how they build community dynamic and social cohesion and so on, and that's nowhere in your studies. So you're a group of guys who just don't know what's going on in the sector. And we don't want to be in that position. So we really would like to be engaging sector people much more. And it is a bit of a struggle because it still is very much, particularly in the US, a particular niche profession. I am an impact evaluator, or I am a randomista. And I think that's unfortunate. And we would have less of these bright ideas from economists that don't actually work when you go to the field being evaluated, I think, if they got sort of truth tested. So actually I think there's something to be learned from clinical trials. And in clinical trials, you have the first in human trials, where you basically take prisoners and homeless people and try out the drugs in them. And then you go to small-scale trials, and then you go to efficacy, and then you go to effectiveness. And I think sort of the equivalent of first in human trials for us should be just go and talk to some sector experts about what your idea is and try it out against them to see if they think it's sensible. And they hopefully also have some historical knowledge about what's been tried before, because there's so much faddism in the sector that one job of academics should be, when someone says, oh, let's do a community-driven development program, we say, well, actually, integrated rural development was based on the same paradigm, and community-driven development programs in the 60s and 50s were based on the same model too, and they didn't have a very good track record. And to actually have that depth of historical experience, which sector people are more likely to have than people who've come up through an impact evaluation career path, whatever that means. So we'd like to draw more on other disciplines. Short answer to your question. Sorry, so Justin.
Thanks. I think there were just a couple things to touch on. One, let me push back a bit on some of the things you said, Howard, in your first comments, which was, and I'm sure you probably don't want to be held to this forever, but this idea that kind of everything works. So in the literature I was reviewing for education, I think a not trivial example at the core of a lot of policy debates for some, at least development donors right now, is this issue of low-cost private schools and private school vouchers. There are signs, I do a lot of work in Kenya. I believe the evidence shows that low-cost private schools perform really well in Kenya relative to public schools. But that's in a context where the public school system is kind of utterly failing. And there's a lot of easy room for improvement over a really kind of miserable public school system. The fact that I get really significant positive results in Kenya doesn't give me any reason to doubt the CIA and Urquiola stuff that private school vouchers in Chile really didn't achieve anything. So I think the heterogeneity is not just a bump in the road on the way to the answer, but is so large and spans both zero effect and spans whether or not a program should be funded, that it's kind of irreducible heterogeneity that we need to give up the thought that we're finding out whether an intervention works and think about a program in a country working. Then just quickly, the point that I think Marie raised about what were we showing with that graph. Just to clarify, we're not averaging coefficients across any studies, kind of quite the contrary. We're trying to say there's two sources of error. We can take, let's say, the Banerjee et al. RCT of class size in India and compare, the OLS estimate to the rigorously identified RCT estimate. How much did those diverge? What was the bias there? The selection problem, versus, if I was trying to choose between the Banerjee et al. RCT estimate in India versus the Kruger RCT estimate in the US, what's the potential for getting it wrong if I choose the wrong country? So we're kind of looking at variances on those axes and showing that the variance across countries is much bigger than the variance between the OLS and the RCT parameter within a single study. Your last comment, though, I think is right. I think in practice, when we do meta-analyses, besides just putting all the things up here in a forest plot, what we tend to do is to group countries kind of ad hoc. We do sort of ad hoc modeling of the heterogeneity well, this is a low-income country with weak institutions, so I think the private school effect is going to be similar in India and Kenya or so on. And I think we just need to be a little bit more honest about what kinds of ad hoc modeling of cross-contextual heterogeneity we're doing when we make these policy recommendations. I think there's a big push within the academic literature to use modeling heterogeneity of effects as a bridge to external validity. I can estimate my treatment effect and estimate a heterogeneous effect by gender, by occupation, and so on. And so in the paper, Lance and I were looking at a really simple education example, the Mansarian returns to education. How much labor market return do you get to education? The bank has collated a bunch of LSMS surveys. You can do this for 120 countries comparably. And you get these dramatically different returns to education across countries. And so you say, fine, let's model the heterogeneity that has to do with gender and occupation and so on. Add all those things. Let the coefficients differ by gender and occupation and so on. It doesn't do anything to reduce the variance of those coefficients across countries. You can't, and we think about the Mansarian returns to education, what determines my return to my education? It's not so much that my personal characteristics, it's that I work in the US where the return to high education is really high. And there's nothing I can do in a sample of Kenyans to predict, what they would earn living in the United States, because the determining factor is the labor market in which I work. So I think some of these issues of heterogeneity are not personal heterogeneity that we can model with any sample. They are irreducibly kind of contextual factors we need to take into account.
Okay, I think I'll just pick up on a couple of those interesting points. First of all, Marie, profuse apologies. Although I would like to add that I did confess up front that I knew I had missed some when I put up that slide, but thank you for that correction. But I do want to pick up on part of your observation and also comments that Howard and Justin had made, which is this issue of aggregating studies, doing meta-analysis, and interpreting, in turn, that meta-analysis. And it seems to me in that literature that there are a whole set of technical issues in terms of, for example, how you construct the standard errors if you're aggregating across studies and so on and so forth, many of which are, amongst people who do this stuff seriously, I think are relatively well understood. I think also that there is, in a sense, a more subtle issue of judgment, which is, in some sense, what are the studies that you're going to put into this meta-analysis or this synthetic review to begin with. If you're looking at something like what is the impact of varying class size on performance of a specific test, in some sense you have a series of technical criteria for the studies, and in some sense that's what you need in order to make those judgments. But oftentimes when we're looking at particular interventions, we're looking at interventions with multiple objectives. So, for example, if we think of the literature on conditional cash transfers and either on nutrition or on education, if you go back and look at, in some sense, the documentation on those programs, oftentimes they say the primary objective of a cash transfer program is to reduce short-term poverty. And then in the documentation around the program and in the evaluation will say, well, this is the primary objective, but it would be interesting to see whether or not it actually has other effects and other things we care about. And so there's a whole series of secondary things which also get assessed as part of that evaluation. So, for example, to take a specific example of this, I was asked to do some evaluation work looking at some cash transfer programs in Bangladesh, one of which was directed at old widows who also did some training on basics of crafts or livelihoods they could take up and hopefully augment their incomes. And our focus initially was what was the income and poverty effects of those interventions. But then, like other studies, we thought, well, it would be interesting to see whether or not there are spillover effects to other household members. How did those benefits diffuse? So one of the things we did as part of that is we looked at the impact of nutritional status of children who happened to be living in these households with these elderly widows. And we didn't find an impact. In fact, the coefficient was actually slightly negative. But we also wrote up in the analysis, this is what we found, but in fact, it's actually not surprising given the characteristics of these programs. And that doesn't mean the program is a bad program. It means that it had this primary objective that it was meeting, but some of these other things it didn't seem to affect. Now, that particular result shows up in the Manley et al. Meta-analysis. And it's actually one of the ones which shows a negative effect, and it actually arguably pulls over the aggregate effect. But it's not obvious that study should have been there in the first place. And so I think as we think more about these meta-analyses, not only are these technical issues, standard errors, all that kind of stuff, but there's also these judgment issues, which is how precisely are we deciding what goes in and what stays out. The other comment I just want to make is there was a discussion about the arrogance of economists. And let's face it, we could go on for hours on that one. But I just want to make one observation, and that's really comes through sort of my experience of working very closely with nutritionists for the last 5 to 10 years, is that amongst nutritionists, they give an awful lot of weight to randomized control trials. And they oftentimes regard those as the gold standard of evidence. But at least amongst the ones that I work with, is they don't necessarily throw out other evidence. They don't say if it's not an RCT, it's worthless. They'll say the things, and I think Justin also alluded to this, is that there can be value in terms of observational studies, in terms of throwing up interesting correlations in the data, maybe posing interesting questions. And one of the features which I really like about the way nutritionists write out their work is if you get to the end of the paper and you get to the discussion part, there's often these paragraphs of this is what we perceive to be a strength of our study, this is what we perceive to be a weakness. And so in some sense, you can then offer an informed judgment about how you interpret the results based on what they tell you. Economists, being arrogant, of course, never have a weakness. So in fact, the idea you could have a section in your analysis that actually says these are the weaknesses of your study is something which, of course, just can't emerge. A consequence of that I perceive within the literature or the work on impact evaluation is that while I'm sort of fully on board on the value of RCTs, and we do them at IFPRI as well, as many of you other do, is that in some sense there's a loss in terms of actually giving any value at all to observational data. And this actually, in the long term, may be something which is going to be costly. This happens in the last 6 or 8 months ago. We were doing some postdoc hiring, and almost all the people we interviewed had done RCTs. And it was clear when we went through the interviews is they were deathly afraid of issues around identification, correlation with unobservables, and so on and so forth. So when we try and tease out some of the things, well, why do you think these things exist? Tell us about the places you were doing this work. It was actually very difficult for people to say that. Now, it meant they had beautifully identified studies. I mean, there was no argument about that. But in a sense, it meant there was a loss in kind of a richness of analysis, better understanding of context. And then we come back to some of the material that Justin was presenting, and we see to a certain extent what are some of the costs of that. Is that we end up giving primacy possibly to one RCT, because it was an RCT, and we really believe the identification, and we lose out on some of our knowledge of the contextual factors and how that might modify the way in which we regard the external validity of that study.
Okay, thank you. We started a bit late, so we'll take a couple more questions if they're out there. Okay, Manu. Okay.
I was just wondering if the panel could reflect on a question that came up earlier about how to do or when to do IE strategically. Given the importance of context that you all have mentioned and how heterogeneity really affects the results, to what extent can we be strategic, or is there a recommendation that really we have to scale up IEs to a certain extent that we have to do IEs at almost every intervention?
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Estelle Raimondo. I'm a PhD student at GW, working intensely on my dissertation topic, and it's probably going to be something like trying to reconstruct the theory of change of evaluation. And my premise is that there might be some flaws in the assumptions that we make between how we use evaluations. And one of the big causal mechanism is scalability. But as we are starting to see, there is little evidence that we can scale up very, very successfully. So I was wondering if any of you have thought about how you lay out this theory of change and what can we generalize. If the results are difficult to generalize, can we generalize about the conditions, about the theory behind the program? Are there elements of it that can be transferable?
Thank you. One final question back there. Okay, thank you. John.
Okay, I think I will take up the first two questions and happily pass the third, which sounded like a really hard one to Howard. On the first one, question about doing IEs strategically. I can sort of give two examples and then hopefully try and generalize from that a little bit. Although, of course, given everything we've said this morning, generalizing off two studies doesn't sound like, two observations doesn't necessarily sound like a good idea. A number of you have made reference to the initial evaluation of the Progressa conditional cash transfer program in Mexico. I was part of the original evaluation team. The evaluation budget for that initial evaluation was something like $13 million. If my math is right, that's like 3 years of, I think, the strategic fund on one intervention. And everyone's going, I can hear you, right? Even up at the front, people are going, wow. Now, if you think about it from a different context, over the last 10 or 12 years, the Mexican government has probably spent $10 billion on those transfers. And it's also worth noting that, for those of you who have read Santiago Levy's book or heard him speak about the development of that program, he and the president of Mexico expended a huge amount of political capital to make it go through. People say all the time, well, in Mexico, they randomize the implementation of Progressa, and we can do that everywhere. And what they forget is the decision about randomization was made ultimately by the president of the country. And it's not clear to me that that is something which is easily replicable all the time. But it also speaks to, in some sense, your point about the strategic value of evaluations. In the Progressa case, basically the president was putting his own credibility on the line. To take a second case, my example of work done on the efficacy of vitamin A. Okay? There are a huge number of studies looking at the efficacy of vitamin A and effectiveness in terms of reducing infant and child mortality. Do we really need 40 RCTs? Well, we could also say that one of the most important development issues we really care about is why do young children die? And that in itself, that's such a big question that that justifies, arguably, all the work and attention and the replication that goes on that particular issue. So it seemed to me that the question about when to do IE strategically is to actually start off by saying, what is the really big question you want to answer? And actually using that as a guide for the allocation of funds. The second question, which I will try and take up a little bit, is about your question about theories of change and evaluation of those theories. And you made a number of good points. The one observation I would add to that is the notion of belief on the part of the people who actually receive this information. I think, and again, as I said earlier, we could go back to the arrogance of economists, and here's yet another example, is it's not uncommon for economists to show up having done an impact evaluation saying, first of all, I'm an economist, so therefore you should believe me. I've done an RCT, so you should really believe me, and therefore you should make these changes based on my particular results. And it seems to me from the perspective of the policymakers, and in particular and also the implementers, who I work with on some evaluations, is that from their perspective, you are just some random person who's shown up. And why should I actually believe you when I might have some friend from high school or college who I think is really smart and might actually be completely wrong, but I actually just fundamentally believe what he's going to tell me. So I think one of the ways in which you can affect change through impact evaluations, perhaps better than we do at the moment, is by emphasizing, as Suzanne did in her presentation, this whole idea of interaction. Okay, so you don't, in some sense, just show up once, but a core feature of this is that you actually have evaluators working with the implementers at all sorts of stages. Now, having said that, there is one danger, okay, and that is the danger of capture, right? Is that if you've worked with people on an intervention for 4 years and you know they've worked incredibly hard and done the best you can, do you really want to say at the end of the evaluation, none of this worked? Surely something works somewhere. And so I think there's this interesting dimension in terms of actually these issues you're raising and also what Suzanne raised, of on the one hand of getting the balance right of being engaged, partly to ensure that you actually do the evaluation right and you understand the program, partly because you have greater credibility in terms of the things you do say when you get to the end, but at the same time also being able to, in some sense, keep yourself sufficiently separate that you can remain independent.
Okay, thank you. Justin.
Thanks. I have just I'm also going to shy away from question number 3, which seems too hard to answer. But briefly, starting from the theory of change, I'm tempted to say that the theory of change of rigorous impact evaluation is that it possesses incredible rhetorical power in, the current intellectual debate. It just is quite persuasive, and they get, well-done impact evaluations get a lot of attention, and there's incredible rhetorical power to this idea of a proven intervention, and I showed it worked here, so you should do what I showed worked there as well. I think what I was trying to argue in my presentation was that the actual empirical underpinnings of that rhetorical case are oversold, but as an empirical matter, it's a powerful tool of persuasion. That takes me to the question about strategic impact evaluation, and should we be evaluating everything? I'm going to take a somewhat exaggerated hardline position here, but I think in response to that, thinking that rigorous impact evaluation probably has too much rhetorical power at this point, we're too eager to make these grand claims of external validity, that we should be evaluating essentially everything. That's going to mean cheaper and quicker evaluations, but that was definitely, I think, the thrust of where I was going was let's not assume because we did it there, it'll work here. Let's put... I'm not talking about what should the Quarterly Journal of Economics be publishing. I don't think they should, publish every CCT evaluation from every country. But we're speaking here mostly as development practitioners within donor agencies. Maybe it does make sense to evaluate everything.
Okay, thank you. Let's pick on something John said again about do you need 40 RCTs on vitamin A. So I think, again, the distinction between efficacy and effectiveness is important there. So we know if children actually get the vitamin A, it makes a difference. And that's established, and that's a universal fact. Yes. But whether the effectiveness of different systems of delivering the vitamin A as the children actually take it, we heard told us the quite an example where the children weren't taking the vitamin. So effectiveness trials actually tell us how you get children, you get adoption, do matter, and they will vary by context. And so there is a need for doing more such studies and understanding the diversity of context when there is external validity to other contexts. Very briefly on the first question on strategic choice, 3i has developed a tool called Gap Maps, which does map out the available evidence in a particular sector by categories of intervention and different types of outcome. I don't have time to say more about it, so just Google 3i Gap Map and you'll come to the right place and you can read all about it. Not now, in a few minutes. On the third question, this is a perennial question, and of course no one's claiming that impact evaluation is the only type of research or even the only type of evaluation. We strongly believe in a broad range of evaluation methods, and indeed, as we have been saying a few times, even experimental, quasi-experimental designs themselves should be embedded in a broader evaluation framework to answer a broader range of questions across the causal chain. And we are talking about large N impact evaluations where we have sufficient units of assignment that you can do statistical analysis comparing treatment groups with comparison groups. And that's what 3i was set up to fund. That's what we're talking about here. And there are huge opportunities still for doing many, many more such evaluations. But there are large classes of activity for which those methods are not appropriate. And so we wouldn't think of using them. Bill gave an example this morning of trade policy in Kenya. You wouldn't think of doing a randomized controlled trial. So we fully recognize that other sorts of methods are required for evaluating those interventions. The drawback is there is not the same consensus around methods as there is for large N impact evaluations. There has been, and there are some critics, but there has been within a large part of the development community a consensus around what large N methods and quality large N methods should look like. And we have been, as Scott mentioned, I think improving the quality of those methods by unpacking the black box more, but around the identification strategies, there is agreement. If you talk about small N studies based on case studies, there's not the same consensus on what that methodology should look like. And I think that's problematic. I think there should be more work towards that consensus. It may not be something 3i is doing. We do have a working paper on this issue, but it's not something we're centrally involved in. So finally coming to the theory of change behind evaluations themselves, that's very much what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. So this afternoon is very much about why are we doing this? Yes, who cares? So 3i's vision statement is improving lives for impact evaluation, which was the subtitle of When Will We Ever Learn? This was not a coincidence. And so we're doing these studies. We want to actually change policies, program design, and improve lives. And so what matters to us is that actually studies are used. And we do at 3IE have some idea about how that operates, and it is about, part of it's about the involvement of stakeholders across the evaluation cycle, not just doing dissemination at the end. But 3IE is in the process of writing its new strategy. And so part of the rationale for this event was just to look back and say, oh, wow, we're wonderful. That's nice, good. But the main reason actually was to say, we're going forward, what should we do? And the reason for convening here in Washington, where there are many, many people engaged in these discussions, is to put it out there to you to say, what should we do? What should 3IE be doing? You know, we've done what we're doing, and you've learned something about that, and you can ask us more, go to our website, look at our annual report, you'll find out more about what we're doing. But if we're really going to make a difference, if we're really going to improve lives for impact evaluation, what is